So according to the channel, Moore's Law is dead. Sony is apparently working on yet another handheld. Yeah, I know recently they released the PlayStation Portal, but come on, that wasn't really a handheld. That was like a streaming device. But this would be like an actual handheld, more in line with the traditional PSP 3 or a PS Vita 2, with a twist. So in the past, I've dismissed the possibility of a new Sony handheld because it never made much sense. The original PSP sold well enough, but a lot of evidence suggests that a large part of the success of that console was just due to pirating software and emulation, as opposed to actually being successful on its own terms. The PlayStation Vita was a disaster, and while many look back on the device fondly, it ended before its time. It cannot be denied that the entire concept was flawed. Game development costs a lot of money. You know, it takes a lot of time to build these experiences, and you want to appeal to the widest audience possible. Why would you want to make a game for a handheld that's only sold 10 million units when you can make a game for consoles that like 150 plus million combined people own, you know? Plus the PC. This is why Nintendo merged their handheld and console divisions, because it's just the sensible thing to do. As game development gets more expensive, these are the compromises you gotta make. But Moore's Law is Dead suggests that Sony has found a way around this. Now I'm gonna link to that video in the description. Go check it out. A lot of interesting stuff in there, but I gotta give my take on this because it's too interesting. Again, take it with a grain of salt. Don't know if it's true, but it might be. The PSP 3, PSP Vita 2, whatever you want to call it, it's going to be a handheld gaming device that can play PlayStation 4 games natively, PS5 games if they receive a patch to add support for the device, and maybe even some PlayStation 6 games. I know this probably sounds pretty far-fetched, more than a little ambitious. The idea of a handheld matching the power of a PlayStation 5, let alone a PS6, whatever that will be, is just silly. But you gotta remember, it's not planning on matching the power, it's just capable of playing the same games. And you gotta remember that this is a device that is early in planning. This would be a 10th generation game console, releasing around 2027, 2028. Running PlayStation 4 games natively should not be a problem, considering that was hardware that will have been out for 14 or 15 years before the time this new thing, you know, is out. PS5 games, that's a little bit trickier to imagine. First of all, it's never common to see a handheld match the power of a previous generation console. But again, it doesn't mean the PSP 3 has to match the PS5 in power just to play those games. Instead, developers would patch their titles, probably scale them down, scale down the resolutions, level of detail, the frame rate. I don't know. Do whatever they gotta do to get this running on a portable device. And I think that's actually fairly realistic. Assuming that AMD's trajectory with AI upscaling moves at a similar rate to NVIDIA's, it's not hard to imagine that a next generation handheld could internally render PS5 games at 480p and then upscale them to 1080p with minimal quality loss, assuming that AMD's AI upscaling gets better. And look, the ability to play PS5 games on the go would require compromises like this, but people have been pretty fine with it in the past, and I think people would be fine with it now. What makes this whole concept so interesting is that it pretty much solves all of Sony's greatest problems with the PlayStation brand going forward. I mean, first of all, let's talk about how it solves the great handheld issue. Developers would never need to make PSP 3 specific games. They wouldn't have to do any work to even get existing PS4 games running on the hardware, which means thousands of games are instantly available for this device. You'd probably have some minimal work to get those patches for the PS5 games. But what's interesting is how this could relate to the PlayStation 6. Moore's Law is Dead speculates that the new handheld will be marketed in Japan as a PlayStation 6 portable. In Japan, home console sales are just not very good. The only console to really have any staying power in the country is the Nintendo Switch. Sony would position the PSP 3 or PS6P, whatever you want to call it, as an alternative to their home console in the region. At least that's what Moore's Law is Dead speculates. But this would suggest that most games developed for the PlayStation 6 would also work on the handheld, right? I mean, it would be kind of silly for Sony to release a new handheld in 2028 that only plays PlayStation 4 titles and select PS5 titles. I mean, in the odd scenario that the handheld actually sells really well, this would create just more incentive for developers to stick with the PS5 rather than move on to the next generation PlayStation 6 hardware. It makes a lot more sense to imagine this as a companion to the PlayStation 6. Without knowing the exact specifications of either the PlayStation 6 or a PSP3, it's hard to know what we're looking at here, but I have a theory. We know that a PS5 Pro is launching in 2024, one that should have a sizable upgrade in power over the original hardware. Arguably an unnecessary leap in power, but whatever. Either way, by 2028, the prospect of a PS6, a next generation leap over the PS5, would just be downright silly. Most would argue that the PlayStation 5 has not seen its full potential remotely realized because it hasn't. Next generation engines are barely even in use. And I think a PlayStation 6, a traditional next generation console, $500, 2028, is a bad idea. I think most people can agree that technology, consumer electronics in general, is kind of slowing down. The generational leap between consoles is less significant than it was before. The gap between the PS1 to the PS2 was big. PS2 to PS3 was big. PS3 to PS4, not so big. PS4 to PS5, for the layman, it's almost unrecognizable. And it's safe to assume that the leap between the PlayStation 5 Pro and PlayStation 6 would be pretty much unnoticeable for most. I would think that the PS6 is not going to be that big of a leap at all. In terms of the console war, Sony has already won, right? Yes, Nintendo has the sales numbers, but Xbox, the primary competition, has not been able to effectively compete. If a PlayStation 6 released that was half the power of a next generation Xbox, developers would still target the PlayStation 6 first. They would treat it as the primary platform because that's the box that most people would have, you know, because most people have all their games on PlayStation, right? I'm just saying, like, that's how the developers see this. This creates an interesting problem for Sony because making a PS6 that is significantly more powerful than a PS5 Pro would actually just cost them a lot of money. It would cost the consumer a lot of money, and it would give Microsoft the opportunity to undercut them in price by a large enough margin that it could make a difference. I mean, imagine that a PlayStation 6 launches that costs $700 versus a next-gen Series S that costs $199 or $299. Hey, that could put Microsoft back in the race for a lot of people who simply aren't willing to upgrade to this, I don't know, a 8K PlayStation 6, a PlayStation 6 that plays games in 16K. I think Sony should play it safe, and I think Sony will play it safe. Take the PlayStation 6 and just have it be a small leap past the PlayStation 5 Pro in terms of, you know, like internal hardware, but use AI upscaling to take care of that generational leap that people are going to want. This would allow the PlayStation Portable 3 and PS6 to really work within the same ecosystem, to play the same games, and developers probably wouldn't feel too bottlenecked by supporting the hardware if this was the case, if the PlayStation 6 just wasn't much different than the PS5 Pro. I'm sure for many of you this seems like a bad idea because it's not more power and that makes it lame, but I think it's something they got to do. The greatest threat facing console gaming is the mobile phone. Not in the same way that it was like 15 years ago. Mobile gaming and console gaming are separate markets right now. But console games, AAA games, are coming to phones. You got Death Stranding running on the iPhone. You got the new Assassin's Creed coming to the iPhone. It's mostly on the iPhone, but I'm sure it'll be on Android eventually. These games run, they work, and while I'm, sure they're overheating the phones, destroying the batteries, sooner or later the phones will get better and better, and people will realize that you can cast devices onto a TV. You could have HDMI out. You can use a controller with your phone. And when that happens, people might just stop buying consoles. The real threat here is investors. Investors want this because the console industry today, while it makes more money than it did 20 years ago because of microtransactions and DLCs and subscriptions, that doesn't mean that more people are playing games than they were 20 years ago. In fact, that number has stagnated, if not declined. This is not something that investors want to hear. Investors want growth above all else because that's why they invest. But this new handheld could actually solve a lot of those problems. There are some fundamental limitations that a smartphone has that a gaming handheld does not. For one, a smartphone is a necessity. You got to have it on you 24/7. Battery gotta last all day. It has to fit in your pocket. A gaming handheld does not need to do that. For a gaming handheld, the battery, all you need is 2-3 hours. It could be larger than a smartphone. This means that, the same cooling limitations don't apply. It can have larger batteries. I don't know. There's a lot of potential here, and a lot of things suggest that this is the inevitable direction the console market moves in. Positioning this new handheld as a portable PlayStation 6 in Japan might help compete with Nintendo over there, but I think this direction might be the fate of all console gaming. Some people have predicted that console hardware in the future will cost over $700 just to keep up with the fact that Moore's Law is dead. Not the channel, but the actual concept. But here's the thing, most people don't really care about visuals that much, and if they do, they already have a PC. And looking forward, clearly, we have a hierarchy in gaming based on price. You have the cheaper consoles like the Series S and portable gaming devices. Above that, you have the premium consoles, the PlayStation 5, the Series X, and above that, the mid to high-end PC market. Now, if you're watching this video, odds are you probably care about visuals and power and frame rates or something like that. But most people don't. There is a reason the Series S outsells the Series X. There is a reason why so many people online are baffled by the concept of a PlayStation 5 Pro. And there is a reason why a lot of people don't upgrade their PCs every single year, because not everybody cares about that kind of stuff that much. And companies, the brands, are gonna start to notice. 20 years ago, it was imperative for console manufacturers to stay up to date and provide consumers with the newest hardware at the cheapest possible cost. Because if they didn't do it, somebody else would jump in. Fancy graphics sold. HD TVs, bitch! Now those rules don't apply. We are at a point where new hardware really does just result in diminished returns, right? The average consumer cannot tell the difference between ray traced, not ray traced, 8K, not 8K. And even if they could, they would probably tell you that they're not gonna pay a few extra $100 for a feature that they could live without. Now look, it's possible that this leak never amounts to anything, that there is no PlayStation Portable 3, but it makes a good deal of sense. And I'm not just saying that because I want another PlayStation Portable. It functions as protection against the threats of mobile gaming. It's protection against cloud gaming as well. It gives insight into a realistic take on a next generation PlayStation home console. I hope this is real. I hope this is real.